few decades ago, not in the memory of some of the people here, but perhaps in the memory of others, a very, very unique voice burst into the comedy world called Monty Python's Flying Circus. And the way that they presented themselves was not like the way other comedians did. They didn't exactly tell jokes, not exactly. And that's why their first collection of sketches was called "And Now for Something Completely Different." And it was completely different. It's true that it had its roots in earlier British comedy groups like Off the Fringe, but really for the world, Monty Python was completely different. We didn't have sketches like how to disarm someone who threatens you with a banana, but Monty Python did. Or the famous dead parrot sketch, which, if you don't know it, you should YouTube it after Shabbos. And the animation was a reinforcement of this, and then, of course, they went on to make movies like Monty Python and the Holy Grail that were also completely different. And when I was looking at this morning's Torah portion, weirdly, that phrase, "and now for something completely different," came to mind. Because the reason that Monty Python used that phrase was to prepare their audience for the idea that they had to change their expectations of what comedy was going to be, and if you didn't, you wouldn't understand what was going on. If you waited there for someone to tell the jokes, and you got instead the ministry of silly walks, you'd be lost. If you read this morning's Parsha, Kedoshim, you realize that being kadosh, being holy, is something that everybody in the ancient Near East understood, but they understood it a certain way. It had to do with laws of purity and impurity and how you approached the gods. And if you approached the gods in a certain way and you didn't violate their laws, you were pure. And ancient Israelites could have understood that, because everyone understood that. There isn't, as far as I know, an ancient religious tradition without laws of purity and holiness. But along comes the God of Israel and says, metaphorically, now for something completely different. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You should love your neighbor as yourself. What is that doing in laws of holiness? Laws of holiness are about how I treat God, not about how I treat you. In fact, we know how ancient pagan traditions treated other people. The altars on which they sacrificed human beings still exist. They've been unearthed. We can see them. Holiness was about pleasing the gods, not about pleasing your neighbor. And we don't realize how discordant this message was to the world around us, to the world around them, unless we look back at ancient traditions and try to imagine what it was to be in a world in which holiness was all about making sure that the gods didn't get you and you had to treat them well. However, the truth is that that message is still hard for people to hear. Because we know that there are people who believe that if you go to synagogue, or if you keep kosher, or if you keep the Shabbat, you can cheat on your taxes. You can cheat other people in business. You can be short or curt or unkind to your kids or your spouse because you're a religious person. After all, you go to synagogue and therefore you are pure. So when we condescend to the ancients and say, didn't you understand that it matters how you treat other people? We have to realize that we don't always understand that it matters how you treat other people. But Rabbi Akiva called this klal gadol b'Torah, the great principle of the Torah, is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You should love your neighbor as yourself. And remember, when the prospective convert comes to Hillel in the Talmud and says, teach me all of Judaism on one foot, what does Hillel say? That which is hateful to you, don't do to someone else. He doesn't say a word about sacrifices, doesn't even say a word about God. He says instead, that is the essence of Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn. That was not holiness in the ancient world, and for many people even today, that's not holiness today. Holiness is about how you treat God, not how you treat one another. But that's not what the Parsha says, and I will go you one better. Some people think that holiness is not only about how you treat God, but how you treat fellow Jews. That's holiness. How you treat your group, that's what matters. But if you believe that, you weren't following the Haftarah. Do you know what Amos says at the beginning of the Haftarah? To me, O Israelites, this is God speaking through a prophet, you're just like the Ethiopians, declares the Lord. True, I brought Israel up from the land of Egypt, but also the Philistines from Kaftor and the Arameans from Kir. In other words, human beings are human beings. And if you treat them badly, then in this new configuration, which is completely different, you're treating me badly as well. If you don't care about groups that are other than you, then you don't care about God. Because every human being is an image of God. And to be holy is to care about human beings. And that was something completely different. And so hard that we're still learning the lesson. You see it over and over and over again in our society. There are people who care about their group, but the people on the other side, or who are different, or who disagree with them, I don't care about them. They're just terrible people. You are just like the Ethiopians, declares the Lord. True, I brought Israel up from the land of Egypt, but also the Philistines from Kaftor and the Arameans from Kir. I don't make those kinds of distinctions, says God. You might think that the people who disagree with you are therefore not worthy of you, but I don't think that. And I created them. So in a parsha on holiness, Kedoshim, the centerpiece is love your neighbor as yourself. You want to be holy? Be kind. You want to be holy? Be good. You want to be holy? Then recognize that other human beings count as much as you do in God's eyes. For the world, it was something completely different. I have to say, for the world, often it still is something completely different. But we have it from Rabbi Akiva, and we have it from Hillel, and we have it from God, that it is the central message of our tradition. When the convert came to Hillel, he didn't say, keep Shabbos, keep kosher, go to synagogue. He didn't say, remember that God is watching you. He said, treat other people the way you want to be treated. That's what it was to Hillel to be holy. That's what it should be to us.